In this first episode, we will explore one of the most defining figures in the history of Europe, Jesus of Nazareth. We will examine the world into which he was born and his revolutionary message of peace, mercy, and brotherhood, which led the moral foundations of Europe. Together, let's rediscover the story of the Europeans.
Today we're looking at what might be the defining fault line of Western civilization. It's this question of how a single, incredibly radical idea could take root inside the most powerful empire the world had ever seen.
We're talking about the world into which Jesus Christ was born.
So our mission today is really to understand the specific environment, both historical and spiritual, that allowed an idea of absolute justice and equality to even survive, let alone flourish. So let's set the scene. We're in Judea.
About 2 millennia ago, right in the middle of what you could call history's first globalization, Rome is at its absolute peak.
It's a superpower like the world had never seen.
The Mediterranean Sea is basically its Roman light.
Completely controlled.
When we talk about the Roman Empire, I think the first thing we have to grasp is its sheer physical and logistical scale. It was a coherent political entity stretching from modern-day Great Britain in the north all the way down to the sun-baked Red Sea. And it encompassed the entirety of the North African coasts. It knitted together civilizations that had, for centuries, been fiercely independent and often at war with each other.
And what Rome imposed wasn't just physical conquest, it was systemic uniformity. The real brilliance of the empire lay in its standardization.
Absolutely. Institutions, law, modes of daily life, they were all streamlined. People from extraordinarily diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds learned Latin, or at least they learned the necessity of it for things like commerce and law.
And they built cities that strictly adhered to the Roman model. It didn't matter if you were in Gaul or in Egypt.
You'd find amphitheaters, public baths, forums, dazzling marble temples everywhere, and it completely overwrote the local building traditions. It was a constant physical advertisement for Roman power and civilization.
The underlying support structure for all of this, the infrastructure, that was the true genius.
It was.
Let's talk about those infrastructure marvels for a moment. Because it's not just about military might, it's about this incredible civil engineering.
Think of the aqueducts. These were just marvels of design that brought clean, running water not just to the central cities like Rome, but often to smaller provincial towns. They sustained massive, dense, urban populations in a way that just wasn't possible before.
And the canals, the bridges.
And most famously, that vast, robust network of paved roads. These weren't just dirt tracks. They were standardized, they were drained, and they were built to last for centuries. They connected the entire empire in a functional, economic way no government had ever achieved before.
That connection is key, isn't it? All roads lead to Rome. This wasn't just about military efficiency.
Not at all. It was the mechanism of their globalization. It allowed goods, taxes, officials, and crucially, ideas to travel faster and safer than ever before in human history.
And what's interesting is that the local elites in these conquered regions, they jumped on board. The initial success lay in Roman cultural policy, which was surprisingly sophisticated for the time.
Very.
The key to their long-term stability wasn't just brute force. It was a form of cultural respect and, well, integration. Conquered elites weren't just suppressed. They were often incentivized to adopt the Roman way of life.
To become Roman themselves. The Latin education, the civic duties, the bathhouse, the forum.
Yeah.
It was an attractive package if you were on the winning side.
This willingness to assimilate was a profound tactical genius, especially when it came to religion. They generally respected the local identities, the local gods.
They didn't force everyone to worship Jupiter.
Not at all. They tolerated and even sort of absorbed new beliefs.
They were constantly absorbing new gods, new myths. It's a process called syncretism.
They treated new gods almost like we treat new celebrities or, bits of gossip. They were novelties, not threats.
Okay, but that leads to a really interesting paradox.
Right.
If there's all this religious tolerance, why was the empire suffering from this deep spiritual vacuum?
Because I think it was less about genuine faith and more about a lack of relevance.
Well, that's the critical distinction. Roman tolerance was political and functional. It wasn't necessarily born of a genuine spiritual conviction. They viewed the influx of new deities, like the Egyptian goddess Isis or the Persian god Mithras, almost as a form of entertainment.
So new gods were just interesting additions to the pantheon.
Exactly. They were new, interesting elements to add to an already crowded, complex collection of stories. It satisfied curiosity and, more importantly, it kept the conquered populations quiet.
So they had all the gods, but no real conviction. You have philosophers, big names like Seneca and Cicero, writing that by the 1st century BC, the educated Roman elite had just stopped believing.
Stopped believing in their own gods.
Yeah. They saw the official polytheistic stories as fables and the Eastern religions as superstitions. The state religion had become a formality, not a faith. So we have this massive, technologically supreme, militarily dominant society that is experiencing a quiet, intellectual collapse of faith right at its very core. If the elites didn't genuinely believe in Jupiter anymore, what kept the entire religious structure from just falling apart?
Well, the practice of religion shifted. It moved entirely from being about genuine spiritual faith to being about civic duty. It was less about expressing personal belief in the gods and more about confirming one's adherence to the community and, crucially, to the state. It was a required participation in public life, a kind of bureaucratic patriotism.
And if you didn't participate?
If you failed to participate in the state cults, you weren't really seen as impious. You were seen as politically subversive. You were a bad citizen.
That's it. And for the majority of people who still held on to some belief, it was almost like taking out an insurance policy. You'd make an offering, hoping for a very specific transactional kind of protection. Protect my harvest or keep me safe on my journey.
The state didn't care what you believed in your heart as long as you performed the public ritual. And this is all happening against a backdrop of, just brutal social division.
It's a found division. The society was built from the ground up on exploitation. And the Olympian gods, who were always portrayed as jealous and cruel and really only caring about the rich and powerful, they were ignoring most people.
Let's get specific about that inequality, because that's what creates the hunger for something new.
Right. It creates the hunger for dignity. And two major groups were invisible, not just to the gods, but to Roman law.
Okay.
First, the enslaved population. At a minimum, 1 out of every 5 people in the empire was a slave. That meant they had 0 rights, no legal status. They weren't people. They were property, belonging body and soul to an owner.
And the second group?
Women. Legally, they were considered perpetual minors.
Meaning they were never independent.
Never. They were always under the absolute control of a man, a father, a husband, who could basically dispose of them with impunity.
So you have this hierarchical society where most people are either property or legally dependent. It just screams out for some kind of spiritual counterweight.
It does. And in this landscape, there was one religion that stood in really stark contrast to all of this.
Judaism.
How did this tradition distinguish itself so fundamentally from the crowded Roman religious marketplace?
Well, the difference is absolute. It's a night and day contrast. You have the gods of Olympus, who are essentially magnified, flawed humans. They were jealous, cruel, prideful, prone to petty squabbles. They had all the worst faults of mortals. And then you contrast that with the Jewish God. This deity was singular, unique, achieving absolute perfection and expressing infinite personal love for the faithful.
That is the essential game-changing theological difference, isn't it? The Olympian gods were aloof. They generally ignored humans. They'd intervene on a whim or when they were provoked. And mostly, they only interacted with the rich and powerful who could afford these grand temple offerings.
Exactly. But this single deity, the one described by the Jewish tradition, cared deeply for everyone. The first true monotheism.
A God of absolute perfection who promised an infinite personal love to his faithful. The difference was just. It was radical. The interest in Judaism was growing, mixed with a bit of envy, I think. It seemed to satisfy these deep needs for justice and worth that the oppressed had, people who were invisible to the gods on Mount Olympus.
Okay, so we see this rising interest. The message is resonating. But conversion wasn't exactly easy, was it?
No, not at all. That was the barrier.
Why was it so difficult to join the Jewish community?
Well, 2 things. First, Judaism wasn't really a proselytizing religion. It didn't actively go out seeking converts. And second, becoming Jewish was a serious commitment. It wasn't a quick decision. It meant a long apprenticeship, strict rules.
A long, serious process of learning the extensive laws, and it required strict adherence to a challenging lifestyle, which included a complex dietary code and observance of the Sabbath.
The foundation of the faith is this special alliance between God and the people of Israel, going all the way back to Abraham.
This promise God made to Abraham to make his descendants a great nation. Abraham, the Mesopotamian cattle breeder, who was called to Canaan.
And this alliance was sealed by a physical act.
The excision of the foreskin, circumcision.
And while the spiritual message of that covenant was profoundly attractive to a Roman pagan who felt that spiritual vacuum, that physical barrier was a major deterrent.
A huge deterrent. For a Roman man, especially an adult, the requirement of circumcision was painful. It was publicly identifying, and frankly, it was culturally repulsive in a society that celebrated the male body in the gymnasium and the bathhouse.
Right.
This specific physical ethnic barrier strongly discouraged many potential converts who were otherwise spiritually drawn to this unique, loving God. So let's pull all these threads together. You've got an empire that's incredibly sophisticated, globalized, but it's spiritually hollowed out for the elites, and it's profoundly structurally unfair for almost everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have Judaism, which offers this beautiful, coherent, spiritual answer, but it's just really hard to get into.
It creates kind of bottleneck. The ideal setting for a new message that could retain the spiritual depth and the moral force of monotheism, but remove those difficult, ancient, ethnic, and physical barriers. That's the perfect storm. That is the context of crisis and unmet need that Jesus just walks right into. His message was, well, it's perfectly timed.
It appealed to two very different groups. First, you have the educated classes. They're looking for meaning, for something more than the frivolous spate cults that their own philosophers had already written off.
And Jesus' message had that philosophical depth. But then, and this is maybe even more important, you have the oppressed.
The women.
All the people we just talked about.
Right.
And they were incredibly receptive to something they'd never had before, something radical. Because this is the core idea, I think. The concept of dignity.
Yes.
Inherent dignity. In the eyes of God, without needing to change their legal status, without needing to perform a painful physical rite. This message gave a sense of spiritual self-worth to people the Roman system treated as objects.
And that is why the promise, the last shall be first, was so dangerous. The last shall be first.
Which is a total reversal of Roman reality. I mean, power, wealth, status, that was everything.
A mindset that valued conquest, patronage, and hierarchy above all else. Roman society depended on a fixed, unchangeable hierarchy. The power of the state was absolute. So if a slave, who is legally defined as property, starts to believe that he is spiritually equal to the senator who owns him,
then he's just found a moral framework that completely bypasses Roman law.
an invisible one, exactly.
And that message destined on giving inherent worth and infinite dignity to the most powerless people in that society. It's what changed the entire course of Western civilization, the moral foundations of Europe.
It introduced a conscience into a civilization that had previously been defined by pure utilitarian power. It's fascinating, isn't it? The greatest material empire in history was ultimately vulnerable not to an army,
But to an idea that started on the absolute margins of its society.
The message was so simple, really. You have your duty to the state, sure, but your true identity, your dignity, that comes from somewhere else, and it's shared equally with everyone.
So this incredible context, the spiritual vacuum, the brutal reality of Roman life, it all brings us to the central figure. We've talked about the moment, but now we have to turn to the man himself.
Jesus of Nazareth. We know him, of course, through the lens of faith, through millennia of culture, art, and, political maneuvering. But our mission today is different.
Quite different, yes.
We're going to use the historian's tools to understand what can be confidently established about this revolutionary Jewish preacher.
We're dealing with primary source material, the Gospels, that was written not as an objective chronological record,
No.
but as a statement of faith and doctrine. We have to, in essence, peel back the theological layers to find the man beneath the message and situate him firmly within the highly turbulent reality of Roman-occupied Judea.
And before we get mired in the inevitable debates over miracles or theology, I think we have to establish the crucial foundational historical starting point.
Absolutely.
For anyone approaching this material from a purely secular or historical perspective, the scholarly consensus is overwhelming. Jesus' existence, his trial under Roman authority, and his death via crucifixion are widely documented. They're effectively undisputed by serious historians.
That's right. That's the bedrock. We know he walked the earth, he taught, and he was executed by the state. The specifics of his death by crucifixion immediately tell you that Roman authority viewed him, at least at the end, as a political threat.
An instigator of unrest.
Exactly. But it's precisely because the primary texts are so focused on the meaning of his life that virtually all the granular details of his birth and early life are so difficult to verify.
Let's unpack this. Let's start with the sources themselves, because there's an inherent problem they present to anyone trying to write a historical biography. The only documents available to us detailing Jesus' life and teachings are the four Gospels: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John.
And we must immediately note the chronological distance. These documents were not penned by journalists reporting live from the scene, as it were.
Yeah.
Scholars estimate the earliest, Mark, was written around 65 to 70 CE. Then you get Matthew and Luke, who appear to have used Mark as a source, which is a critical point.
Right.
And finally, John, which may stretch into 100 or even 110 CE. We're talking about documents composed several generations after Jesus' death.
So we're talking about non-eyewitness accounts, aren't we? We have authors who were attempting to synthesize and gather oral traditions, fragments of memory, foundational sermons.
And filtering all of that through their own theological needs, their cultural assumptions, sometimes 40, 50, or even 70 years later.
They were written to establish belief, to articulate the nature of the Messiah,
and to demonstrate how Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled in Jesus. They prioritized theological explanation over neutral chronology. This foundational aim immediately renders them not entirely reliable as straight historical accounts in the modern sense.
That chronological gap must make the historian's job almost impossible then. I mean, how do you even begin to check claims when the documents themselves are so explicitly focused on faith?
This is where the historian's toolkit becomes genuinely forensic. You can't simply take the narrative at face value. Instead, we have to rely on a detailed, exhaustive understanding of the first century context. Roman tax law, the geography, social structures, the political tensions. You use all of that to perform cross-checks. You separate the improbable from the plausible in the gospel narratives.
So you can reconstruct the broad outline by asking, did people in Roman Galilee truly behave this way? Does this political backdrop make sense for this event?
Precisely. We use the established context to scrutinize claims.
Let's apply that process then to the biographical foundations, because that's where the first major assumption shifts. It's generally accepted that Jesus came from a large, pious Jewish family in Galilee, a rural region in northern Palestine.
That fits perfectly. Galilee was his base of operations, the region where he spent almost all his life in ministry. So it makes perfect sense that he would be born there.
But then we hit the Bethlehem narrative, the bedrock of the Christmas story. And this is where the historical lens diverges sharply from the religious one.
It does indeed.
Historians dismiss the gospel assertion that he was born in a manger in Bethlehem. Why is that? It's such an essential component of the faith narrative.
It's essential because Bethlehem was the city of David. For Jesus to be the legitimate prophesied Messiah, he had to be born there, according to the established tradition of the Old Testament. The narrative serves a very powerful theological purpose.
Fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. The Bethlehem story is, for most historians, a literary device employed by the gospel writers, specifically Matthew and Luke, to give Jesus the correct messianic lineage. And that's why historians lean so heavily toward Nazareth, his family's known home, as his true birthplace.
And the dating itself is a subtle but important historical correction. We typically think of the birth year as year 0, but it's actually earlier.
Yes, between 7 and 5 BCE, it's a small correction that demonstrates the effort to sync the narrative with external records, like the death of Herod the Great, a known figure in the story.
Now let's move to his social status, because that's vital for understanding his later politics. Joseph, his father, was referred to by the Greek term tekton.
Tekton. It's a word that contains so much fascinating ambiguity. It's often translated simply as carpenter, suggesting a man of simple means, a modest artisan.
But it could mean more.
Oh, much more. The term is broader in first century Greek. It means a craftsman or a builder. In a fast-developing region like Galilee, this could mean he was a highly skilled mason, or even a contractor involved in major construction projects.
So not necessarily a poor peasant.
Not at all. At the time, nearby Sepphoris was being rebuilt as a major Roman city. If Joseph and Jesus were involved in that kind of work, they might have been part of an affluent, mobile artisan class.
The difference between the two interpretations is staggering. A humble carpenter or a skilled professional, perhaps frustrated by the system he witnessed.
The scholarly tendency is to acknowledge the ambiguity, but to emphasize the geography. Regardless of whether he was affluent or modest, Jesus grew up geographically isolated from the powerful politico-cultural centers of the Roman Empire. Jerusalem was 140 kilometers away.
A different world.
A completely different world. Galilee was a tough rural region where peasants struggled under heavy Roman taxation.
That environment, that crucible of rural hardship, must have been instrumental in shaping his profound empathy for the poor.
It almost certainly was. It explains the raw material of his message. His experience was rooted in the suffering of the occupied, the taxed, and the overlooked.
Then we hit the massive silence in the historical record.
It's a profound biographical gap from infancy right until his emergence as a public figure. We can only assume Jesus lived the normal life of a pious Jewish man in Galilee, likely working in his family's trade.
The missing years. The Gospels reveal virtually nothing about his first 3 decades. And he reappears suddenly.
Around the age of 30, Jesus emerges, joining the movement surrounding a man called John the Baptist.
And this moment, this is the true historical starting gun for his ministry, isn't it? John the Baptist was a popular and, well, a powerful apocalyptic preacher.
Very powerful. He practiced a ritual purification called baptism, a call for followers to immerse themselves fully in the Jordan River to cleanse themselves of sins. This was a public, often dramatic declaration of repentance.
A powerful symbolic movement of renewal.
And Jesus submitting to this baptism under John became far more than just a personal act. It, of course, became the first sacrament of the emerging church.
But what does his submission tell us about his early understanding of his own mission?
It suggests humility and initially a recognition of John's authority. He was starting as a disciple or a follower of an established prophetic tradition. Historically, it roots Jesus firmly in the prophetic reformist tradition of Judaism.
So, following his baptism, we move into this famous period of withdrawal and preparation. He disappears into the Judean desert for 40 days of fasting.
Yes. And this period is just rich with Jewish historical significance.
Yeah.
The number 40 is symbolic of testing and preparation all across the Old Testament.
40 years the Israelites wandered. 40 days Moses was on Mount Sinai.
Exactly. 40 days Elijah fled persecution. This physical and spiritual withdrawal was an intentional alignment with the great prophets before him.
And it remains spiritually essential today. This episode is, of course, commemorated by Christians globally during Lent.
And the desert ordeal culminates in the temptation narrative. The Gospels describe the devil attempting to tempt Jesus with, well, 3 core elements. Immediate material satisfaction turning stones to bread, spiritual vanity, and finally, worldly power dominion over all kingdoms of the world.
And his resistance to these is critical for understanding his later ministry. He rejects materialism, spectacle, and earthly power-driven authority.
And he emerges fully convinced of his mission, a mission of announcement, to declare the imminent arrival of the kingdom of God on earth.
A radical message.
A truly radical message. Because the God he announced was not the vengeful God often associated with immediate judgment, but one portrayed as uniquely just and merciful, saving those who accept him regardless of their current status.
And to carry this message, he selects 12 apostles, predominantly ordinary fishermen.
Yes. His ministry began geographically focused, preaching in synagogues and markets, primarily around the Sea of Galilee.
But what was the immediate source of his rapid fame? Was it the preaching itself?
Initially, his reputation was built less on theological novelty and more on direct physical action, his abilities as a healer, a miracle worker. In the first century, physical illness was often interpreted through a spiritual or moral lens. Disability or disease could be seen as the result of sin or ritual impurity.
So when the Gospels recount him performing miracles, healing the infirm, the blind, lepers, it was more than just medical restoration. It was a profound statement of divine authority.
Precisely. To heal the sick was to forgive their sins and restore them to the community's full social and spiritual standing. This was presented as undeniable proof to his followers that God had descended among humanity through him. This spectacle drew massive crowds.
But we absolutely must zoom out now and place Jesus firmly within that chaotic first century landscape, because the historical error is to view him in isolation.
Absolutely.
Jesus was one of many Jewish preachers claiming a divine mandate. He wasn't a unique historical anomaly. He was a product of an intense environment.
And this environment was indeed a crucible of conflict and corruption. Palestine had been occupied by Rome since 63 BCE. Roman law superseded Jewish religious rules, placing immense structural pressure on Jewish life and tradition.
And this Roman presence created profound internal division, didn't it? Jewish society fractured over how to respond.
Completely. You see reform movements constantly accusing the mainstream of being corrupted by Greco-Roman culture. The Jewish elites had largely assimilated. They were, in effect, collaborators who maintained their power through Roman tolerance.
The spiritual heart of Judaism, the Jerusalem temple, became complicit in that corruption.
It did. The temple, intended as the holiest site, had degenerated into a bazaar that actively exploited the piety of pilgrims. The economics of faith were devastatingly cynical.
Can you detail that exploitation? Because Jesus' later actions really depend on this.
Of course, first, currency. Diaspora Jews had to pay a tax in a specific local coinage. The money changers operating in the temple offered exchange rates that were often dishonest.
And the sacrifices.
Pilgrims who traveled long distances couldn't bring their own animals. Temple merchants sold certified sacrificial animals at exorbitant monopolistic prices. The temple establishment was growing obscenely wealthy by preying on the most pious.
So a society suffering Roman military oppression and now being economically exploited by its own religious leaders, this led to a range of intense Jewish responses.
Exactly. The Essenes and other ascetic groups advocated withdrawal from the corrupt world entirely. They lived in desert communities, waiting for God to intervene and destroy the wicked order.
A passive resistance.
A passive resistance. And the violent response were the Zealots. They believed the only way was through direct armed struggle against the Roman occupiers.
And the Romans, of course, monitored this political powder keg with extreme prejudice.
Violence was the primary language of control. They repressed any semblance of rebellion. The consequences were immediate and public. We have to remember the Roman warning. Shredded, crucified bodies were routinely positioned along the roads near cities.
A terrifying, visible deterrent.
A constant reminder that any challenge to imperial authority would result in the most agonizing and publicly humiliating death possible.
This constant threat, coupled with the internal corruption, fueled an apocalyptic fever.
Yes, this is critical because it defines the core expectation of the time. The messianic expectation. The Messiah promised in the Old Testament was understood by many to be a military, political liberator, a king who would physically expel Rome.
So Jesus was preaching right in the epicenter of this highly charged expectation. If that's the environment, we must now turn to his actual message. What did he intend? His primary goal was not to create a new religion.
No, his initial aim was reform. It was a radical call for his people to return to the foundational origins of Judaism, reconnecting with the oral tradition, the Talmud, and the written text, the Torah. He wasn't advocating abandonment.
He was advocating for a shift in emphasis.
A profound shift. He provided an interpretation of the law that was incredibly soft, merciful, and tolerant, especially in contrast to the rigid legalism of some of the established factions.
And this leads directly to a core innovation, the birth of universalism, the radical concept of love for the stranger.
Yes. While Jewish religion already preached love for one's neighbor, this was understood quite strictly.
Traditionally, neighbor or brother applied specifically to the children of Israel, those within the covenant.
Jesus took that tribal ethic and shattered the boundaries. He demanded the very same treatment, the same radical love for the stranger, for the enemy, and by clear extension, for all humanity. This is a monumental departure.
But how revolutionary was that, really? I mean, didn't Greek philosophy already discuss a kind of universal brotherhood?
It was revolutionary because it was rooted in the nature of God, not just human reason. Jesus' extension was theological. All humans, regardless of their background, heritage, or religion, are equally children of God. This established Christian universalism. It immediately challenged the idea of God's covenant being exclusive to one nation.
Immensely threatening to those who saw their privileged status as divinely sanctioned.
He also fundamentally innovated in the realm of justice, pivoting sharply toward mercy over strict retribution. He directly challenged the established Jewish law of talion.
An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Exactly. And that law is often misunderstood as primitive vengeance. Historically, its function was actually to limit vengeance, to ensure punishment didn't exceed the crime.
But Jesus went far beyond that. He demanded unconditional forgiveness.
His new commandment, delivered in the Sermon on the Mount, was breathtakingly radical. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just a call for passivity. It's a profound philosophical statement, an active form of nonviolent resistance.
It is. The core philosophical rationale is that fighting evil with evil ensures that evil always prevails, trapping society in an endless cycle of retaliation. The only means to truly stop it, according to this teaching, is through unconditional love and pardon.
And these weren't abstract ideals. Jesus' sermons immediately disturbed not only religious norms, but the entire social order of first-century Palestine. They were inherently subversive.
He was relentless. He accused the elites, both religious and economic, of being corrupt and violating the core tenets of Judaism, rendering them unworthy of God's blessing.
His most famous attacks were aimed squarely at wealth and privilege. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. Wealth is a profound spiritual impediment.
It's a barrier to salvation, a devastating blow to the religious elites whose wealth was derived from the temple. And he didn't just criticize them, he directly attacked the very guardians of the Jerusalem temple.
Connecting back to the bazaar and the corruption?
Yes, he publicly reproached them for betraying divine laws, specifically by using ritual purity laws as an instrument of social exclusion.
Prohibiting access to the holy place for the infirm, the destitute, prostitutes.
The impure. The temple was weaponizing purity to maintain social stratification. And Jesus' response was the ultimate act of defiance. He publicly defended these marginalized groups. And crucially, he arrogated to himself the right, a right reserved only for the temple guardians or God, to forgive their sins.
That wasn't just social commentary. That was a direct theological challenge to the political power structure that Rome had sanctioned.
Exactly. The ultimate threat wasn't just the claim to be a Messiah, it was the claim to overturn the social and spiritual hierarchy of the entire temple system. The social reversal warning was explicit. The poor, the weak, and the outcasts would be the first to enter the kingdom of God, while the rich and powerful would be the last.
In a hierarchical, status-driven society like Rome and Judea, that teaching was truly anarchic.
It inverted the entire established social pyramid.
And this inherent threat to the temple's economic power, to the Roman peace, to the social hierarchy, explains why both the local Jewish elite and the Roman administration ultimately sought his execution. He was simply too disruptive to ignore.
When we synthesize all this, a clear historical figure emerges. Jesus' teachings weren't just abstract theology, they were a radical call for social justice, peace, universal brotherhood, and revolutionary mercy.
These profoundly revolutionary teachings irreversibly changed the Mediterranean and European landscape.
Even though these values have been constantly betrayed throughout history, they nonetheless form the founding ideal of the European Union.
It's a powerful legacy. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the historical Jesus.